They laughed at his damaged armor until he removed it, and the hall fell silent. The shuttle door opened, and the sound hit me first. Not a welcoming sound, not even an indifferent one. It was the particular kind of sound a crowd makes when something unexpected and slightly ridiculous walks through a door. A ripple of noise that starts at the front of a room and rolls backward in a wave, picking up volume as it goes, until the whole space is vibrating with it. I had been inside that shuttle for 9 hours, crammed into a cabin the size of a broom closet, running on black coffee and a protein bar I had found at the bottom of my kit bag. I had spent most of those 9 hours reviewing summit notes and trying not to think about how the chest plate of my armor was pressing against a bruise that had not finished forming yet. I stepped off the ramp and kept walking. The grand conclave of civilizations met every 2 years in a space station orbiting a dead star called Virath. The station itself was magnificent, genuinely and impressively so in the way that things built by old civilizations tend to be, with no concern for cost and every concern for legacy. 3 kilometers of reinforced alloy and smart glass, shaped like a nautilus shell, rotating slowly to produce artificial gravity in the inner rings while the outer sections stayed still for the observation decks. The inner chamber, where the delegates gathered, was a domed hall large enough to hold a small city block. The ceiling was transparent, and through it you could see the star below, cold and white and ancient, the kind of thing that makes you feel small just by existing. The kind of thing that was burning long before any of the civilizations in this hall had learned to make fire, and that would keep burning long after all of them had found a different way to keep warm. 412 delegates from 41 recognized species sat in tiered rings around a central floor. The seats were arranged by membership rank. Full members sat in the first 3 rings, closest to the center, with the best sightlines and the most comfortable furnishings, because when you are a full member of the conclave, the universe arranges itself accordingly. Associate members occupied the middle rings. Provisional members like Earth sat in the very back, in the upper tier, behind everyone else, as if even the architecture of the place wanted to remind you of your standing before you had opened your mouth to say a single word. I found my row and walked toward it. The laughter followed me the whole way. I knew what they were looking at. I had known from the moment I boarded the shuttle back home, when I had stood in the small transit locker and looked at the suit hanging in front of me, and made the calculation that every person in my position eventually has to make. Do you spend the time fixing the appearance of a thing, or do you spend it preparing for the work the thing is meant to help you do? I had 14 hours before departure. I had used them preparing. The armor was not presentable. That is the polite way to say it, and I am capable of saying things politely when the situation calls for it. The suit had been issued to me 14 months ago, shining and new, the best thing Earth's defense manufacturing could produce at the time. Reinforced composite plating, thermal regulation, electromagnetic shielding, built-in life support for up to 6 hours in hard vacuum. We were proud of it, the way you are proud of something you built carefully and at great expense. The engineers who had designed it had spent 4 years on the specifications. There had been a small ceremony when they handed it to me. Someone had taken a photograph. It did not look that way anymore. The chest plate had a deep gouge running from the left shoulder to the center, a wound in the metal that had never been properly repaired, not because I had not tried, but because a proper repair required equipment I had not had access to at the time, and had not had time to access since. The right pauldron, the piece that protected the shoulder, was simply gone. What remained was a jagged edge where the attachment points had been torn free. The left side of the torso bore 3 overlapping burn marks, the kind left by extreme thermal exposure. Not a fire, a different kind of heat entirely. The lower back section had been dented inward and then beaten back into rough shape by someone who knew what they were doing but did not have the right tools for the job. That someone had been me, at 2 in the morning, in a maintenance bay on a station I had never visited before and have not visited since, using the blunt end of a pressure wrench. There had not been time to replace the suit before the conclave. There had not been time for a lot of things. I had received the notification for the summit while I was still on a transport heading back from the outer boundary of charted space, and the window for departure was narrow, and Earth could not afford to miss it. Provisional members who missed summits without filing an acceptable reason lost standing points in a system I found maddening in its complexity but could not afford to ignore. We had already lost a small number of standing points the previous year due to a budget shortfall that had delayed our membership fees by 3 weeks. So here I was, walking through a hall full of alien delegates while they laughed at my broken suit, and I was keeping my face neutral and my pace steady and my hands relaxed at my sides, because that was the job, and this was part of it, and I had made my peace with that in the first hour of the shuttle ride when I had run out of the energy required to be upset about things I could not change. A delegate from the Vreth, a species that resembles something between a tall insect and a very opinionated university professor, leaned toward the creature beside it and said something in their language. I do not speak Vreth natively. I had been learning it for 8 months from an audio program that was not designed for human vocal anatomy. My translation implant caught the words a half-second later and rendered them into something my brain could hold. Scavenger, it said. And then, with what I could only describe as warm amusement, in broken tin, the creature beside it produced the layered clicking sound that served the Vreth as laughter. They did not lower their voices. They were not trying to be subtle. Why would they be subtle? I was in the back row of the provisional tier, and they were full members with 4,000 years of political history behind them, and the math of that situation was very clear to everyone present. I sat down in my seat and placed my helmet on the table in front of me. It had a long crack running across the visor. The crack had been sealed with emergency resin, which had dried a slightly different shade than the rest of the material, so it looked like something repaired by a person in a hurry in the dark, because that was exactly what it was. I had done it by feel in a corridor where the lights had not been functioning because the power to that section had been rerouted to life support, and I had been working with one hand because the other one was occupied with something else at the time. I folded my hands on the table and looked at the central floor below. A delegate from the Ohal, a species I had thought about a great deal in the past year, was seated directly below me in the tier beneath mine. The Ohal look something like tall gray foxes, precise and elegant in everything they do, from the way they arrange their notes to the way they hold their bodies in a room. This one was holding up a thin device and pointing it in my direction. It took me a moment to understand what it was doing. When I understood, I sat with the understanding for a moment and did not react to it. It was taking a photograph. Not a research photograph or a documentation photograph. The kind you take when you want to show someone back home something that illustrates a point you have been trying to make. Something like, look at what passes for a delegate these days. I watched it do this and said nothing. I thought, briefly, about standing up and walking back out. Not because I was ashamed. I want to be clear about that. I was not ashamed of the suit or of what had put it in that condition. What I felt was something quieter and more specific. A tiredness with the performance of judgment. The way a room full of creatures who had never been to Kareth 7 or Veth Station or Leth Vareth Orbital could look at the evidence of what those places had required of a person and see only a presentation problem. But I did not stand up. I stayed in my seat, because Earth could not afford for me to walk out. I reached into the side compartment on my right leg and took out my data tablet. The screen had a crack in it too. I had dropped it during a fast decompression event 3 months ago, and the crack had not spread since then, so I had stopped treating it as an urgent matter. I opened my notes for the session and began reviewing them, because in 412 delegates there were at least 30 whose positions and likely votes on the key agenda items I had not yet fully mapped, and I had work to do. The opening ceremony began. A long formal address from the sitting chair of the summit, a Sanathi delegate named something I had learned to approximate as Areth. Areth had a voice like still water, clear and unhurried, and spoke in Galactic Standard, the constructed language that all species used in formal settings, a tongue that was nobody's native language, and therefore nobody's home advantage. I listened to the opening address, and took notes, and observed the way the room arranged itself, who sat close to whom, which sections of the chamber communicated in the margins while the official words went on, where the real attention was, and where it was only performing. The Vreth elder who had laughed at me, 3 rows down, turned completely around at one point to look at me openly. When our eyes met, he held the look for a long moment. In Vreth culture, I had been briefed, that kind of prolonged eye contact was a form of dismissal. Like closing a door on something that was not worth opening. I looked back at him steadily until he turned around. Then I wrote a note in my tablet. Vreth elder, senior tier, visual dismissal, opening session, likely leading voice on provisional conduct issues. Watch carefully. I had a feeling I would need to know that later. The summit did not get easier on the second day. I say this not to complain. Easier and harder were not categories I spent much energy on at that point in my posting. I had been doing this job long enough to understand that easier and harder were simply the texture of the work, the way any work has texture, and that what mattered was not the texture but what you built in spite of it or because of it. What I mean is this. On the second day, sitting in the upper tier listening to the formal sessions, I heard for the first time, in a direct and official way, the shape of the problem that had been forming in the margins. The first session of the second day was a trade dispute between full member species. I will not summarize it in detail except to say it was conducted at the level of quality you would expect from civilizations that had been negotiating with each other for centuries. The Vreth argued with architectural precision. Their points were structured like load-bearing walls, each one designed to support the ones around it. The Ohal representative, a female I knew by designation as Ohal 7, spoke with the controlled clarity of someone who had reduced emotion from her delivery so completely that listening to her felt like reading a very well-organized document aloud. I admired them both, even when I disagreed with their positions, because admiration and disagreement are not mutually exclusive things. I had been an engineer before this job. Structural failure analysis. I spent my career looking at things that had broken and determining why, and what could be done so they would not break the same way twice. I was good at sitting with a problem for a long time before deciding I understood it. I was comfortable resisting the urge to name something before I had examined it from enough angles. That patience had transferred to this work more directly than I had expected. During the morning recess, I reviewed the charter, the formal document that governed how the conclave operated. Not for the first time. I had read it 3 times before I took this posting, and had been reading sections of it ever since, because the charter was the grammar of this place, and you cannot operate in a language you have not learned. I was looking for a specific provision. I had noticed something in the language of a particular section that I had not paid close attention to before, a clause about the rights of provisional members in relation to motions that directly affected their status. I found the provision. I read it twice. I made a note. In the afternoon session, the motion came to the floor. A proposal to establish formal conduct standards for provisional members, including minimum requirements for diplomatic representation. The language was careful and formal. It spoke of dignity and standards, and the importance of the conclave maintaining a consistent quality of appearance. It did not mention Earth. It did not need to. I had walked into this hall the day before in a suit that looked like it had survived a war, because it had, and 400 creatures had watched me do it, and now here was a motion that would establish, in formal charter language, that a representative who looked like that could be asked to leave. The Vreth elder, Reth Avarat, rose to speak in favor. He was good. He was genuinely good, and I noted this the way I noted everything useful, carefully, without letting the noting distract me from the listening. His speech was structured like a building, each argument supporting the next, the whole thing designed to bear the weight of its own conclusion. He spoke of institutional standards. He spoke of the message it sent to developing civilizations when provisional members arrived in poor condition. He spoke of the conclave's responsibility to model a certain kind of seriousness for the communities watching from the edges of galactic civilization. He was not wrong about any of it in the abstract. That was the difficult part. In the abstract, a case for presentation standards is a reasonable case. It was only when you held it next to the specific reality of why my suit looked the way it looked that the abstract began to separate from the actual. He did not look at me while he spoke. He did not need to. After him, a Denari delegate raised a procedural objection and the motion was tabled for the day. But tabled is not gone. Tabled is waiting. I knew it, and everyone in the chamber knew it. I spent the third evening in an observation corridor on the outer ring of the station, a long glass-walled passage that looked out over the dead star. I went there because the light was good for thinking. White and clear and exact, the kind of light that does not allow much softness, which was appropriate for the kind of thinking I needed to do. A young OHAL delegate found me there. She was junior, an observer in her delegation's support staff, not yet assigned to formal sessions. Her name translated to something I began calling Avith, because the actual pronunciation required throat movements that were not part of my anatomy. She stood beside me at the glass and looked at the star for a long moment before she spoke. She told me she had been on Veth Station 18 months ago. A junior research assistant, assigned to the lower deck with 59 colleagues when the pressure seals failed and the bulkhead door locked from the wrong side and the water began rising. She told me that someone had held that door open from the outside for 11 minutes. Long enough for all 60 of them to get through. She looked at my right shoulder, at the jagged edge where the plate had been. I looked back out at the star. The door pressure was significant, I said. Whoever held it probably did not want the associated paperwork. She made a sound that was almost a laugh, quiet and uncertain. Your shoulder plate, she said. The door tore it off on my way out, I said. I had the angle wrong. My own fault. We were quiet for a while. My senior delegate will vote in favor of the conduct motion when it comes to a full session, she said eventually. I wanted you to know. It is political, not personal. I thought you should know anyway. I thanked her. She left. I stayed at the window and looked at the star and thought about the vote that was coming. I thought about 11 minutes holding a pressure door. I thought about 60 people moving through a corridor they had not expected to be able to move through. I thought about the moment the door tore the plate free and the cold hit my shoulder, and I had thought, in the clear and calm part of my brain that stays clear no matter what the rest of it is doing, if I let go now, 60 people die. So I did not let go. I went back to my room and opened the charter again. I had been looking at it with one particular frame in mind, the defensive provision that allowed a provisional member to request a formal review of any motion affecting their status before it came to a vote. That provision was real, and it was available to me, and it would buy time. But sitting in that small room, with the dead star going cold and white outside the porthole, I realized that buying time was not what I wanted to do. I wanted something different. Something the charter also allowed, in a separate provision, one that required a specific kind of nerve to invoke because it put you alone in the center of a hall in front of 400 watching eyes with no procedural shelter between you and whatever judgment was coming. I opened a new file. I began writing. The formal language of the conclave was precise and structured, and I used it as accurately as I could. I wrote until the star dropped below the station's rotation, and the porthole showed only open dark. Then I saved the file, set my alarm, and lay down still wearing the suit because I was too tired to take it off. I slept better than I had expected. The morning session of the third day opened the way they all did. Arath spoke the formal words of opening. 400 delegates settled into their seats. The overhead panels gave the central floor that particular quality of light that made everything happening on it look slightly more significant than it might otherwise. I had noticed this on the first day and decided it was probably intentional. Architecture does things like that. You build the light to carry some of the weight. I was in my seat in the upper tier, helmet on the table, cracked visor facing up. My hands were folded in front of me. My tablet was open to the file I had submitted at 4 in the morning, the formal request for the floor. Under charter rules, a provisional member's request for personal testimony on a matter affecting their status had to be acknowledged in the same session in which it was filed. It was one of the few protections the charter gave to members in the lowest tier. The first item on the agenda was a trade report. I listened. I took notes. The second was a committee update. I listened and took notes. The third was the conduct motion, returned from its tabled position, ready for a full floor session. Reth Avarat rose. He spoke. He was exactly as good as he had been before. When he finished, Arath opened the floor. A Denari delegate began raising the same procedural objection as before. Arath said, "Before the procedural matter is addressed, the chair has received a request for the floor from the Earth Provisional Delegation on a matter of personal testimony relevant to this motion. Under Charter Section 41, Provision 7, this request must be acknowledged in the current session." The room shifted. Not loudly. A murmur, the sound of 400 creatures adjusting their understanding of what this session was going to be. I stood up. "Earth acknowledges and thanks the chair," I said. My voice was even. I had spent 20 minutes before the session making certain it would stay even. "I request the floor for a period of no more than 10 minutes. I will not use all of it." Arath looked at me across the tiers for a moment. Then, "The floor is recognized. 10 minutes." I picked up my helmet. I walked down the stairs from the upper tier. Every step I took further into the lower hall, the noise of the room decreased by a measurable degree. By the time I reached the central floor and turned to face the full chamber, it was very quiet. 400 sets of eyes, compound eyes, singular eyes, eyes arrayed in configurations that had no human equivalent, all of them looking at me, standing in my damaged suit in the center of the hall. I set my helmet on the floor at my feet. "I am going to do something," I said, "and I want to explain it first, so there is no confusion about what it means and what it does not mean." I paused. "What I am about to do is not a gesture of defeat," I said. "It is not a request for sympathy, and it is not a performance. It is a submission of evidence. The Vreth delegation has moved to establish standards of presentation for provisional members. I am a provisional member. Before this body votes on any standard that applies to my delegation, I want the record to contain a complete account of what this suit represents. Not what it looks like, what it represents." I reached up and released the latches on my chest plate. The room became very still, not the stillness of boredom or indifference, the stillness that comes when a body of people has collectively decided, without anyone saying so, that this is a moment that requires stillness. I lifted the chest plate free and held it in my hands. The metal was heavier than it looked, not because of its physical weight, but because of everything it had been through. I held it so the chamber could see it clearly. The gouge running from the left shoulder to the center. The stress marks around the edges of the gouge where the metal had flexed under a force it was not built to absorb easily. The discoloration from heat. Then I set it down on the floor beside the helmet. Underneath the plate, visible to the full chamber through the compression suit I wore beneath the armor, was the evidence of what had happened before the plate came off in a medical bay on a station called Karath 7. The scarring ran from my left shoulder down across the chest, curving at the ribs, fading at the lower abdomen. Old enough to have settled, the skin pale and slightly rigid where the healing had gone deep. The kind of marks that have a story, and the story is not a short one. 14 months ago, I said, a mining operation on Karath 7 experienced a catastrophic shaft collapse during active extraction. 43 personnel were in the lower shafts when it happened. The collapse triggered a secondary event that began a slow structural failure of the upper shaft housing. Rescue teams from 3 different species assessed the situation. They concluded that the geometry of the collapse made interior access impossible within a safe operational window. Their assessment was accurate. The risk was real. I looked at the Vreth section of the chamber. The 43 personnel in the lower shafts were Vreth nationals, I said. Scientists and engineers from the Vreth Geological Survey. The rescue teams that assessed the situation and withdrew to safe distance were operating correctly under their own protocols. I am not criticizing that decision. It was the correct decision under their parameters. I set the right arm section down beside the chest plate. I had different parameters, I said. I entered through a secondary access tunnel that the rescue teams had not evaluated because it was not on the station plans. It had been added during a structural modification 3 years prior, and the documentation had not been updated. I found it by reading the physical geometry of the shaft housing and identifying where the measured space did not match the recorded layout. No sound in the chamber, none at all. I reached 29 of the 43 in 4 trips, I said. On the 5th trip, with 6 still inside, the shaft housing began its final collapse sequence. We had to take a different route, faster, which meant harder. A support beam came down at an angle I had not anticipated, in poor visibility, while I was moving quickly. It struck the chest plate at speed. The force transferred through the plate into the left side of my body. I kept moving. We reached the surface. I looked at the burn marks on the torso section. The thermal markings are from a separate event, I said. The full report is a public record available through Leth Vareth Orbital Station Authority. What I will say here is that a shutdown sequence required manual activation, and the override mechanism was located inside an active thermal exhaust path, and I was the only person in that section of the station at the time. So I went in and I activated it. I began removing the torso section piece by piece, setting each part carefully on the floor beside the others. The shoulder plate, I said. I touched the jagged edge where the attachment points had been torn free. A delegate in this chamber knows the full story of this one. I will not tell it without that person's permission. What I will tell this chamber is that the plate was removed by a force I did not apply to it, in a situation where removing myself from that force was not an option I was willing to take. I stood in the compression suit in the center of the hall. The scarring was fully visible now. The full scope of what 14 months of going in, when the assessment said not to, had left on a body that had not been designed with this in mind, but had shown up and done it anyway. 400 creatures from 41 civilizations looked at it under the exact, clear light of the overhead panels and said nothing. I am not angry, I said. I am not here to make this body feel guilty. I am not asking for recognition or for a change in my standing or for any adjustment to the way Earth is treated in this hall. I looked at the full sweep of the chamber, all of it, every tier. I am here because a motion has been introduced that would judge the fitness of a civilization's diplomatic presence by how its equipment looks, I said. And I want the permanent record to hold, in complete detail, what this equipment actually represents. I picked up the chest plate from the floor. I held it facing outward, the gouge visible to everyone. Every mark on this suit is a problem someone said could not be solved, I said. A shaft collapse the rescue teams walked away from, a bulkhead door that was locked from the wrong side, a reactor override that required going somewhere no one was supposed to go. In every case, experienced and capable teams made a correct assessment that the window was too narrow and the risk was too high. In every case, Earth reached a different conclusion. I set the plate back down. Earth has one representative at this summit, I said. One suit, one cracked tablet, one person in the back row of the provisional tier. I understand that this does not look like much. I am not asking you to pretend that it does. I looked at Rethavarat. He was looking back at me, completely still. But before this chamber votes on what a civilization's representative should look like when they walk into this room, I want you to sit with one question, I said. When your people were inside the shaft, behind the door, trapped in the failing station, when the window was closing and the assessment said there was no way through and the professional response had already withdrawn to safety, was there anyone still coming toward them? I let the question stand in the silence. Because Earth was coming, I said. Earth is always coming. That is not a boast. It is a fact you can verify. Kareth 7, Veth Station, Leth Verith Orbital, 3 events, 3 public records. 3 situations where Earth was not asked, was not coordinating, arrived without invitation, and went in. I looked at the chamber. This is not a damaged suit, I said. This is a record of service that no report has ever fully captured. And I would wear it exactly this way, into this hall or any other hall in the galaxy, without changing a single detail, because this armor did not fail. It held, every time, and so did the person inside it. I yielded my remaining time. I stood on the central floor and waited. The silence stretched past the point of ordinary quiet and became something else entirely, something with weight and texture, the silence of a room that is doing something with what it has just been given and does not yet know how to put into words. Then Ohal 7 said, from the second tier, "Chair." Aerith looked at her. Ohal 7 requests a formal pause in session, she said, to allow delegations to consult. Aerith granted it. Nobody left. Nobody stood up. Nobody moved at all. 400 creatures from 41 civilizations sat in their seats and looked at the armor on the floor and looked at me standing next to it and stayed with what they were sitting with. Arath waited the full 10 minutes before calling the session back to order. The formal pause had not been used for consultation. Everyone in the chamber understood that. It had been Ohal 7's way of giving the room time to absorb something without making it look like the session had simply stopped. She was precise, as I had already noted, but she was also generous, which I had not yet written down. I updated my assessment of her. When Aerith spoke again, his voice had the careful neutrality of a person steering something much heavier than it appears. "The floor is returned to the motion from the Vreth delegation," he said. "The chair invites a response." Reth Avarat did not stand immediately. In every session I had observed, he was consistently first to his feet when his motion was addressed. This time, he stayed seated for a beat longer than protocol required. When he rose, his voice was slightly different, a degree less constructed, a fraction more careful. "The Vreth delegation," he said, "wishes to request a recess in formal consideration of this motion, to a future session, for additional review." It was not a withdrawal. The distinction mattered, and everyone in the room knew it. A recess was a door left slightly open. A withdrawal was a door closed. He was not closing the door, he was stepping back from it because the ground in front of it had changed. I was still on the central floor, collecting the pieces of my armor from where they lay. I began walking back toward my seat. The Denari delegate stood while I was climbing the stairs. "The Denari delegation," she said, in the measured tone of someone who had been thinking very carefully for the past 10 minutes and had arrived at a specific destination, "does not believe a recess is the appropriate response to the testimony just entered into the record." I stopped on the stairs but did not turn around. The testimony entered today documents 3 separate events in which the Earth Provisional Delegation engaged in direct life-preserving action on behalf of citizens of full-member civilizations, she said. This delegation has reviewed the publicly available incident reports for 2 of those events. The reports are consistent with the testimony given, in every detail. I reached my row and sat down. "The Denari delegation moves," she said, "that the motion regarding provisional member conduct standards be not recessed but formally withdrawn, and that the complete record of today's session be entered into the Conclave's permanent historical archive as a matter of ongoing documentation." Arath looked at the chamber. "Is there a second to the Denari motion?" A pause, long enough that some might have wondered. Then Ohal 7 said, "Ohal seconds." A shorter pause. The Savith delegate, all four of her arms resting flat on the table, said, "Savith seconds." Aerith called the vote. I watched the board on the central screen. The numbers moved steadily. The Vreth delegation entered a formal abstention, which was not an endorsement and was not opposition. It was a door held at a very small angle, which was something. The motion passed, not unanimously, but clearly. I sat in the back row and watched the result display and wrote it in my notes with the date and time, and then I moved to the next page because there was still a full afternoon session and I had work to do. In the break before the afternoon, I went to the Earth delegation room. I ate a ration bar and drank some water and sat in the quiet for a few minutes. I looked at the armor stacked in the corner. A knock at the door. Reth stood in the doorway. He was taller without the formal ceremonial additions his species wore during sessions. Older looking too. He entered the room and stood near the chair without sitting, because the Vreth find the geometry of human chairs incorrect. He looked at the armor in the corner. Then he placed one hand briefly on the chest plate. The chitinous fingers rested on the gouge for exactly 3 seconds, then withdrew. "In Vreth culture," he said, "in careful galactic standard, we do not have a practice for the thing I want to express. Our nearest equivalent is a word we use when acknowledging a debt that cannot be balanced, a debt with no available currency." He said the word in his own language, a layered, clicking sound made by multiple structures simultaneously. My translation implant made no attempt at it. "There is no translation," he said. "I am told that is appropriate, because most species also lack the concept." I looked at him. "I did not go into the shaft because your people were in it," I said. "I went in because people were in it." He held my gaze for a moment. Then he inclined the upper part of his body at the precise angle that my briefing materials had told me, communicated something close to, "I see you clearly, and have decided you are worth seeing." He left. I finished the ration bar. The afternoon session ran 30 minutes over schedule. 3 items, all requiring careful attention, none as heavy as the morning had been. By the time it concluded, I was tired, in the specific way that comes from being extremely focused for an extremely long time. I wrote my evening notes, 17 follow-up items, 3 new relationships to understand more carefully, 1 unexpected opening in a trade conversation I had not anticipated, and 1 permanent entry in the conclave's historical record, reference number noted, filed and unchangeable. I turned off the light and lay down on the bunk in the suit because I was too tired to take it off, and I looked at the ceiling in the dark, and I thought about a dead star burning patiently outside the window regardless of anything happening in the rooms around it, and then I fell asleep. I had not expected what the 4th morning brought. The session opened on a standard agenda. I had prepared for another long day of careful attention and incremental work, which is what most days in this kind of work look like. The dramatic moments are not the bulk of it. The bulk of it is patience. The sustained and unglamorous patience of a person who is building something that cannot be built quickly. What I had not prepared for was Ohal 7 standing at the opening of the session and requesting the floor on a matter not on the agenda. Arath acknowledged her. An off-agenda request from a full member at the start of a session was unusual enough that the chamber settled into focused attention before she had said a word. "This delegation," she said, in that precise and controlled voice of hers, "wishes to enter a formal motion for consideration by the full chamber. A motion of elevation regarding the provisional membership status of Earth." The chamber was completely still. A motion of elevation. I had read about them in the charter during my initial preparation for this posting. They were rare by any standard. A full member sponsor was required, and passage required a 2/3 majority of full members present. If it passed, the provisional member moved directly to full membership, bypassing the normal 6 to 12-year process. It had happened 4 times in the conclave's 300-year history. I had read about each of the 4 cases because I read everything I could find about this institution, and I had never imagined I would be sitting in the chamber while a fifth was introduced. I kept my hands still and my expression neutral. "Ohal moves," she said, "that Earth be elevated to full membership status, effective at the close of this summit, with a formal commendation entered into the permanent record detailing the basis for this elevation. Specifically, the 3 documented events in which the Earth Provisional Delegation provided direct life-preserving assistance to citizens of full member civilizations during the period of its provisional membership." She sat down. Arath looked at the chamber. "Is there a second?" The Denari delegate was on her feet before Arath finished the sentence. "Denari seconds." The Savith delegate, all 4 of her arms extended slightly outward, said, "Savith seconds." Then a voice from the Vreth section. Not Rethavarot, a younger delegate, a female by the markings on her anterior casing, someone I had not paid close attention to before. She rose and said, in clear and careful Galactic standard, "Vreth thirds the motion." Rethavarot did not look at her. He looked at the central floor below. Whatever he was thinking in that moment, his face, as far as I could read a Vreth face, was not opposed. It was something more complicated than opposition. It was the expression, I decided, of someone who has been somewhere for a very long time and has just seen the view shift. The procedural period for objection ran its required length. No objection came. Then the vote. I watched the board on the central screen. The required threshold was 2/3 of full members present. The numbers climbed at a steady pace. There were holdouts, as there always are. The Vreth senior members, including Rethavarot, abstained again. A small cluster of others did the same, but the margin that formed was clear. When the final count displayed, I read it. I wrote it in my notes with the date and time. Then I looked up at the screen and let it be real for the length of a breath. Arath announced the result. The chamber applauded. Not politely, not with the formal restraint of a body observing protocol, the genuine kind, the kind that happens when something resolves in a way that was possible but not certain, and the resolution arrives. Each species expressed it in the way their body allowed. Some made sound, some moved. The Savith waved all 4 of her arms in unison, rapidly, which was a display I had not seen from her species before, and which, I later learned, was their highest form of public approval. The Denari tapped the table in a rapid, sustained rhythm. The Vreth elder did not applaud. He sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at the central floor, and his expression, still complicated, had shifted slightly toward something I did not yet have a word for. I stood because protocol required it. I placed my hand over the damaged chest of my suit. I inclined my head to the chamber in the closest thing a human offers as a formal acknowledgement in a room that does not have a human-specific protocol for moments like this. Then I sat back down and returned to my notes. After the session, 3 delegations requested brief meetings. I scheduled all 3 for the following morning. I went to the Earth delegation room and ate my last ration bar and made a note to find the station's food dispensers, because I had been operating on a budget that had not accounted for 5 full days, and I was now at the end of my own supplies. Avith found me in the observation corridor that evening for the second time. The dead star was below us, the same it had always been. We stood at the glass and said nothing for a while. My senior delegate reviewed the Veth station report last night, Avith said. The complete report, including the pressure readings for the bulkhead door during the 11 minutes and 40 seconds it was held from the outside. I looked at the star. She wanted me to tell you that she read those numbers, Avith said. Not the summary, the actual load readings. She wanted you to know she understood what those numbers mean for a body that is not built from OHAL materials. We were quiet for a moment. What did she say after she read them? I asked. Avith was still for a moment. She said she was glad the door held, she said. And she said she was glad you held. I nodded slowly. We looked at the star for a while longer. Then I thanked her, and she left, and I stood at the window alone for a few more minutes, and then I went back to my room and finished the evening notes and turned off the light. Outside, the star burned. The shuttle back to Earth took 3 days. I spent the first day sleeping, not reviewing notes, not drafting the formal report, not preparing for the follow-up meetings. Just sleeping in the narrow bunk in the small cabin that was the Earth delegation's transit quarters, which meant a room the size of a large closet, with a porthole the diameter of my hand showing stars, and, when the shuttle's rotation allowed, the familiar shape of one arm of the galaxy that looked, from this distance, like someone had spilled light very slowly across a very dark surface. It was enough. I have never needed a lot of space. On the second day, I began the formal report. The format was the one I always used. 1 page. Outcome first. Then the procedural events that produced the outcome. Then relationships established, meetings scheduled, items requiring follow-up, reference numbers for any formal record entries. I listed the elevation motion and its result. I noted the commendation in the permanent archive and included the reference number so it would be easy to locate. I did not write about the laughter when I walked into the hall on the first day. I did not write about the photograph, or the word scavenger, or the moment I stood on the central floor and the room went silent. I did not write about the Vreth elder and the word with no translation, or Avith at the window, or the specific quality of the applause when the vote came in. Those things were real. They had happened, and they mattered, and they would stay with me for the rest of my life. But they were not the report. The report was 1 page. On the third day, with Earth visible through the small porthole, blue and round and closer with each hour, I opened the storage compartment and began putting the armor back on. I had been offered new equipment before leaving the station. The Conclave's logistics division maintained materials for member delegations. They had a replacement chest plate in approximately the right specifications, shoulder sections, patching materials for the thermal scoring. They could fill the gouge and replace the missing plate and make the suit look the way it had looked 14 months ago. I thanked them and declined. Putting the suit on in the small cabin, piece by piece, I stopped when I picked up the chest plate and looked at the gouge. The long score running from the left shoulder to the center. I ran my thumb along it slowly. The metal had bent under a force it was not designed to absorb easily. In a dark corridor with poor visibility, while I was moving fast toward the surface, with 6 people behind me. I had felt the impact through my entire left side, a force that rattled from shoulder to hip and made the situation very clear in a very short amount of time. And the clear part of my brain had said, keep moving, 6 more people inside. So I had kept moving. The plate had taken the force. That was what it was built for. I had taken the force. That was what I was there for. Neither of us had stopped. I put the plate on and latched it and picked up my helmet. There was a message from Caroline waiting in my system. I had been putting it off in the way you put off things when more pressing things are happening. I opened it now. She had kept it short, the way she always did. Heard the outcome. Well done. Replacement armor is being sourced. Should be ready within the week. I typed back, keep it. I am keeping mine. A pause that was probably her reading that twice and deciding what to think about it. Then, understood. That was all. I put on the helmet as the shuttle began its descent. The heat of re-entry turned the porthole from blue to a brief burning orange, the color that means you have come from somewhere far away, and the atmosphere is doing the honest physical work of slowing you down. It always lasts about 40 seconds. Then the blue comes back, and you are home. The landing was smooth. Caroline was waiting on the landing pad with 2 cups of coffee. She was a calm and competent woman who had been running Earth's small and consistently underfunded diplomatic office since before I arrived in it, and she understood, better than almost anyone who had not done this work directly, what it cost. She handed me the coffee and looked at the suit. She looked at the gouge and the burn marks and the missing plate and the cracked visor. She did not say anything about any of it. She said, "Good trip?" "Productive," I said. She nodded. We walked inside. The office was small and warm and smelled like recycled air and old paper, a smell I had not realized I associated with home until I walked back into it after months away. My desk was where I had left it. The stack of correspondence on it was higher than I had left it. The coffee was good. Caroline always made good coffee. It was one of the reliable things. I sat down and opened the report on my tablet one final time and read it through before submitting it. 1 page. Concise. Factual. The outcome. The process. The follow-up items. Nothing extra. Nothing personal. That was the discipline, and I maintained it. I submitted it, and set the tablet down, and held the coffee with both hands, and looked out the office window at the sky above the city. It was the specific blue of a planet that has air and water and 8 billion people in it, going about their lives, unaware of and unconcerned with the particular mechanisms by which those lives continued to be possible. They were making meals and arguing about small things, and worrying about money, and laughing at things that were actually funny, and falling asleep in the middle of quiet afternoons. They did not know that 3 days ago their civilization had been 1 vote away from losing its seat at the only interstellar body that mattered. They did not know about the laughter in the hall, or the photograph, or the 400 delegates in complete silence while a person stood in a compression suit and named his scars. That was fine. That was right. That was how it was supposed to work. You do not ask them to carry what you carry. You carry it so they do not have to. You go to the halls they cannot reach, and you sit in the back row where provisional members sit, and when the moment comes that requires more than sitting, you stand up and you walk down to the center, and you say the thing that needs saying, and you let the room decide what to do with it. Caroline knocked on the doorframe and told me the first follow-up meeting had confirmed its date. I wrote it in my notes. She asked if I needed anything else before she left for the day. I told her no and thanked her for the coffee. She left. The office was quiet. I looked at the armor in the corner where I had set it against the wall, the chest plate with its gouge, the torso sections with their burn marks, the helmet with its cracked visor, the jagged edge where the right shoulder plate had been and would not be again. I am not a hero. I want to be clear about that, the way I have been clear about other things in this account. I am an engineer from a mid-sized city who was given a set of equipment and a title that no human had ever held before, and was told to represent 8 billion people in a hall where we sat in the back row. I did the work in front of me. When the work required going somewhere difficult, I went. When it required staying past the point where staying was comfortable, I stayed. When the door needed to be held, I held it. That is what the 8 billion people behind me would have done. Every one of them. If they had been the one in the suit, and the one in the position, and the one standing in front of the choice, they would have made the same decision. I know this because I know where I came from. We are not a species that is comfortable waiting at a safe distance when people are still inside. It is not in us. We go back in. We always go back in. The record in the conclave's permanent archive will say that Earth became a full member on a specific date, by a specific margin, with a specific commendation entered into the historical file. It will be a short entry in a very long document. It will be accurate. It will be there long after I am gone, long after this suit has finally been retired, long after the dead star finishes burning and goes dark. What the record will not say, and what I will not write in any formal report, is how it felt to stand in that hall in a suit full of dents in front of 400 creatures who were learning, in real time, what those dents meant. It will not capture the specific weight of the silence that followed. It will not put a word to the thing the Vreth elder expressed when he placed his hand on the gouge and said a word that had no translation because most species lacked the concept. Those things live where they live. I finished the coffee. I started on the follow-up preparation for the next summit, because the next summit is in 2 years, and 2 years is a shorter time than it sounds when there is this much still to do. At some point, the sky outside the window had gone dark, the ordinary dark of a city at night, and I understood that a significant portion of the day had gone past without my noticing, which is either a sign of productive focus or of a person who needs to remember to eat dinner. I saved my work and turned off the light. I stood in the dark for a moment and looked at the armor in the corner. All of it exactly as it had been. All of it exactly as it would remain. The dents, the gouge, the burn marks, the empty space at the right shoulder, the cracked visor of the helmet. The armor had held, in the shaft and behind the door and in the exhaust path. In the hall, with 400 watchers and across 3 days of a summit that had started with laughter and ended with something that had no word for it in most languages. It had held because it was built to hold, and because the person inside it had refused to let go. The dents were the proof of that. The armor still had the dents. It always will. That is the point.